Okay, so today, just to remind you the structure of this lecture, it will be between 1.5 hours. There will be no breaks, and this lecture would provide this talk would provide a broad introductory overview of the Orthodoxy in the British Isles, and today we will be talking about re-emergence of Orthodoxy in the 16th century in Britain. At the end there will be Q&A session, so anyone who wants to ask any questions, please do so. Also during the webinar, if you have any questions, you can jump in as well. Also, there will be a quiz at the end of the lecture to see whether you were not sleeping during it and we were listening carefully and can basically answer the questions. There will be 5 multiple choice questions. The successful participation in this quiz will be required in order to receive a certificate of learning or attendance for this series, which I will send to you. Yes, as I said, this webinar will be recorded and then displayed. All 5 of them will be on YouTube channel when I finish them after the last one, week after the next one. Right, and also at the end I will ask, as usual, to provide for your feedback and to see whether you're happy with the content and with the delivery. That's important for me to know where I am. If I'm too boring, or you still can basically bear with me. Right, so without further ado, we're going into the webinar now. There will be people joining, so I'm just admitting them, so there's no one helping me today. Right, Orthodox Renaissance in 1700 to 2000. So we will be covering a period of 300 plus years. In fact, it actually started earlier than 1700. So today we will be talking about the Orthodox returning to the British Isles. We will talk about the Greek and Russian communities coming here, then setting up the embassy church, as it was called, where for quite some time, for almost 150 years, both Greek and Russians, they prayed together. We also mentioned some Armenian churches were established in the 19th century here, although they are not, we don't regard them as fully Orthodox, they were still here. There was Armenian diaspora in the 19th century as well. Then we will talk about what happened after the Russian Revolution, when the embassy church stopped being here and the church is split into the actual Russian Orthodox Church and church abroad. We'll talk about parishes outside of London. We also cover some of the Greek churches which were established in the 19th century here, and also cover the Orthodox monasteries and talk a bit about Exarchate and Moscow Patriarchate. For those who basically don't know what Exarchate is, I will explain later. And at the end, we will talk about the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, which was established in 1928, and which was basically a fellowship between Anglican Church representatives and Orthodox representative. Initially, it was mainly Russians, but then Greek Orthodox joined, and later on Romanians and many others. It does still exist, so I'll cover that later on. It's quite interesting webinar, I hope, and yeah, let's start. Okay, sorry, it is a busy slide. Take your time, I won't be rushing. So what happened in 1054? There was a schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church based in Byzantium at the time. And since that time, 1054, we regard Catholic Church as not part of our Orthodox Church, and therefore the British churches, the churches, mainly Church of England, which was located here, it was under, until 16th century, under under control of Roman Church, and after that, after Henry VIII left Catholic Church, they established Church of England. Again, it was a Protestant church. Again, it was not part of Orthodoxy. So therefore, when the Greek, around 100 families came to England, to London actually, in 1670, this is the time when we are counting that Orthodoxy was returning to the British Isles. And at that time, there was also a big concern because the Roman Catholic Church in 16th century started moving into Palestine and into Egypt, and they wanted to bring the Christian East under papal authority. And therefore, Patriarch Cyril Lucaris of Alexandria, he actually sought support from Protestant country, mainly England, to strengthen Orthodoxy. And in 1617, in 17th century, he communicated with the, at the time, Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, and asked whether he could send some of the Greek students to England to study theology, so that they can get educated and they can basically work and protect basically Orthodox from the Catholic influence at the time. So that was actually met with quite welcome, and Archbishop George Abbot, he responded, and on behalf of King James I, he invited Greek students to come to study theology. Unfortunately, it hasn't really worked out for quite some time, and it's only at the end of 16th century, 17th century, sorry, at the time, some of the British English Church of England representatives, it actually happened, and a Greek college was established at the existing Oxford College. So just quickly going back to the Greek families coming to London in the 1670s. What happened, because obviously when they came, they needed place of worship. Then the church was sorry. Okay, a second. Sorry, I'll just admit a few more people coming in.
Good.
Second. And hold on. Okay. One more person joining. Yeah, my apologies, because I'm on my own today. I have to do it all by myself now. Okay, good. So, yeah, one more person joining. So what's happening is that then in 1677, application was made to the King James, and he actually agreed that for the Greeks to build a church, which was correspondingly built in the Greek priest Daniel Bulgaris, who was actually doing that. He obtained permission to establish a Greek Orthodox Church in London, and the project was supported by Joseph, Archbishop of Somers at the time, who raised funds, and King from King Charles. Sorry, it wasn't King James; it was King Charles at the time, and also the Duke of York. They actually funded this church, which was built correspondingly in it was called Soho Fields in Soho, and the church where it was standing is still there. The actual street, it's called Greek Street in Soho, and but because at the time the Church of England was rather strict, and they really objected to Orthodox practices such as the use of icons, veneration of saints, the Church of England at the time was very sort of protective and very of their own domain, and they didn't really tolerate other religions. So essentially they disputed, and it turned out that the land on which it was built did not belong to the Greek Church, so it belonged actually to the Church of England, so they took it. So this church only existed for several years, and actually it was opened in 1677, but it was actually shut down in 1682, so it really only existed 5 years. But the legacy survives, that Greek street in Soho still exists, as I said. So that was basically first attempt to establish a place of worship in London. But going back to the Greek college, it was also a short-lived kind of enterprise. Sorry, more people coming in. I'm just admitting them. There was eventually the Greek college was formally established in 1699. It was mainly due to one of the professors, one of the college masters. It was a gentleman called Dr. Benjamin Woodruff, who was principal of Gloucester Hall, Gloucester Hall, which is part of the Oxford College. The idea obviously had much older roots, going back to the beginning of that century, but it was only materialized at the end of the century. And at the time, there was unusual period of unusually close contact between the Church of England and the Orthodox Church, where Anglicans, particularly a part of Anglicans which separated from Church of England, they really wanted to get close with it was called non-jurors. They were trying to get close with Orthodox churches. It didn't work out at the end, but at the time there was lots of activity there. So, to support for the scheme for this college came from influential figures, including Lord Paget, who was English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, and he was and the representative of the Greek Orthodox Church as well. So to house the students, Woodruff, the master of the college, he constructed a separate building, and that building essentially allowed about 15 Greek students to come and to study. And they came mainly from Greek islands in Mediterranean. But when the Greek Church, some of the bishops learned about this, they actually protested, and because they thought that the Greek students, they will be subject to Anglican proselytism, and they were very worried that the Greek students would be influenced by Anglican theology and essentially will be converted to Anglicanism. So they protested, and unfortunately the Greek college didn't exist for too long. It's only 6 years, and it was shut down, unfortunately. So that was a second attempt which didn't quite work out. But in addition to these events, then what happened is that the Metropolitan Arsenius of Thebais, which is one of the bishoprics in the Patriarchate of Alexandria, he visited England to collect some money to support his church. And he rented a house in London in 1713 and started church services, because there was a big Greek community and there was no church services. So he started doing it in his house. And he was on his trip. He was accompanied by Archimandrite Gennadios, and they both saw that there was a really demand for worship services, but unfortunately the Greek families, they were poor and they didn't have much money. So what happened is, at the time, Russians, they were setting up an embassy in London, and some of the embassy people, they started coming, and the ambassador came for some of the services. And Metropolitan Arsenius used it as an excuse, as an opportunity, and essentially he asked the ambassador whether the embassy could support building a new church, whether Russian basically emperor would support. And what happens at the time, Russian Emperor Peter the Great, who is depicted here in the traditional Russian sort of clothing, he was visiting Europe to learn practical skills of shipbuilding and other things. And he was, at the time, he was visiting in Holland. So what Russian ambassador did, he suggested that Metropolitan goes to Holland across the channel and ask him the money directly, which Metropolitan did together with Archimandrite Gennadius. They went to Holland. Peter the Great, he was quite happy, and he suggested, yes, definitely we can support you. And he asked to go back and, he asked them to go back and talk to the embassy. And so he basically gave his permission for some money to be released towards this. Then Metropolitan Arsenius went to Russia to visit Russia to collect some money, and then he returned back to Alexandria to his bishopric. But the Archimandrite Gennadius stayed back, so he went back to England. And he set up this new Greek-Russian church. Oops, sorry, go back. Happened. Sorry about this. Okay. So he went back to England and set up first church, the Mission of Mother of God, which was in York Buildings near Strand. You can see this exchange court. It was somewhere, one of these buildings. That's where the church was. It's just off Strand, for those who know London. It's at the time the embassy did not really give money to build new churches, but they provided money to rent a place in this exchange court, and also they provided money to support the priests. So Archimandrite Gennadius, he was first rector, and he has served there for over 20 years. Okay, let me admit other people. And okay, and I will also make Max as my co-host so he can admit people as well. Okay, right, he's here now. Excellent. So the church was supported by the Russian embassy, and in 1737, the Archimandrite Gennadius died, and priest monk Bartholomew, Greek as well, he took over from him, and he ran the church until 1946, where Stefan Ivanovsky, he took over. Again, he was in charge of church. He was the director until 1969. The church moved to another location near Piccadilly, and then Archpriest Andrei Samborsky, who is depicted here, he became director. And after that, basically the church was run mainly by Russians. Andrei Samborsky was quite an important person. He was because it was at the time it was regarded as embassy church. The rector, they not only provided service to parishioners, but they also supported embassy in various embassy activities, promotion of orthodoxy. So he was quite an important and busy gentleman. In 1780, Archpriest Yakov Smirnov, or James Smirnov, took over, and he was the longest serving rector. He served for 60 years as a rector. And unfortunately, there's no picture of him at the moment remaining, but there's his plaque in Kensal Green cemetery where he is buried. So anyone visiting Kensal Green, hopefully you can find it there. Then church moved to Great Marylebone Street, and we go to next slide. And after that, it moved to Welbeck Street, which where it existed for over 1 century until after the Russian Revolution. And there were two priests, and then there was Eugene Popov and Archpriest Eugene Smirnov. They depicted here. So Eugene Popov, he was a Master's of Theology from St. Petersburg Theological Academy, and he was transferred to London from Copenhagen, where he was serving as a priest. Yeah, he was quite theologically minded, and he engaged in correspondence with various theologians at the time. He tried to promote Orthodoxy. He corresponded with well-known English Anglican theologians such as William Palmer, Joseph Overbeck, and Stephen Hatherley. And Stephen Hatherley, by the way, was the first Englishman ordained as an Orthodox priest in England after the Great Schism almost 1,000 years ago. During the Crimean War, when England fought with Russia and Ottoman Empire, the Father Eugene, there were prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, taken in Crimea and shipped to England. And Father Eugene traveled weekly to prisoner of war camps in Plymouth, in Lewes, and Sheerness, and ministering to hundreds of Russian prisoners and advocating their welfare. In Plymouth, he also established a temporary chapel with some choirs from Russian prisoners. Father Eugene Smirnov, he was the last priest in that church, in the Embassy Church. He's here. He started in 1875, and then he was serving there until 1928. And he was also a graduate from St. Petersburg Theological Academy. He was a reader in Russian Orthodox Church in New York, and then moved to London. He was also a gifted church writer, publishing books in Russian and English, contributed numerous articles to Russian church journals, and his correspondence included leading church figures of that age, including Archbishop Tikhon Belavin, who was later to become the first Russian Patriarch of Moscow after the synodal period, Saint Tikhon. He also corresponded with Saint Nicholas of Japan, and also chief procurator of the Synod, of the Holy Synod, Konstantin Pobedonostsov. So during his tenure, the London Church continued to grow. He appointed a permanent deacon in 1867, and also established in 1895, Russian heir to the throne, Nicholas, a future Tsar Nicholas II, visited England, and he was very unhappy about the choir, because the choir was really not good. And what he did when he returned back to Russia, he asked the Synod and Russian bishops to arrange for choir and basically send some people down to London so that they can have a proper choir there, which has actually happened. So that's basically about this church. At the same time, in the 19th century, what happened is that there was an influx of Greek immigrants into the country, quite large. Russian community remained very small, but the Greek community actually was growing very fast. So in 1815, the Ioannidis family of merchants settled in London. They were actually benefactors of the Victoria and Albert Museum. They donated quite a lot of money when it was built. And then essentially they helped to build a church. The first church was built in Finsbury Circus, because that's where, because there were traders, merchants, they were all sort of living in city of London, and that's where they opened the sort of first church. So it came into existence in 1838 in Finsbury Circus. but later it was superseded in 1849. They built actually the Church of Christ the Saviour in London Wall, and also about the same time, the Greek families established a chapel in Waterloo Road in Manchester in 1843. And also in 1861, they built the Church of Saint Annunciation in Manchester as well. So in 1870s, the Church of Byzantium style church was built in Liverpool. By the way, you can see the Church of Annunciation in Manchester, quite impressive building. And also a church in Cardiff has been established. It was all Greek Orthodox. Okay. Sorry, I'm just quickly. Okay, here. Right, all the people. Okay, so everyone is in. Excellent. And also importantly, in 1877, a foundation stone was laid for the Cathedral of St. Sophia in London. According to one account, Russian Tsar Alexander II, he wanted to build a Russian-style church in London, similar to those which are being built around, in other major cities in Western Europe. In Germany, there were lots of churches built at the time, Russian churches. But unfortunately, because there were not too many Russian people here, the Russian ambassador at the time, he told the Tsar that if he builds a church, it will be more like a burden for the small Russian community. But he said, because there was a large Greek community, he suggested to donate the money and to build a church for Greek Orthodox, which he did. And that's why it was built in a road which was called Moscow Road in Bayswater. I guess many of you know that, and many of you have been there. And the first services there were held there in 1879, and it was consequently consecrated in 1882. At the same time, there were some Armenian churches built. As I said, in Armenian they're not regarded as fully Orthodox. But still, there were relatively large communities here in London and Manchester, again, trading communities. So they established a parish in London and also a church in Manchester. Okay, move on. Now we come to the 20th century. So what happened in the 20th century? Actually, quite a lot. That's when the Orthodox, obviously, community started to grow, and in addition to Russian, Greek, and Armenian communities, there were other communities established throughout this period. But I'm not going to cover it. Just at the moment, just focus on the Russian London parish. So in 1919, after the revolution, when the Bolsheviks, communists, took over power in Russia, and the Tsar actually abdicated, Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The English authorities, they did not recognize Soviet Russia, and therefore the relationship were severed, and therefore there were no embassy not required. So what happened that the embassy church ceased to exist, and instead, but there were still obviously parishioners, quite a lot of them, because there was influx of people after the revolution. Russian immigrants came, not huge numbers, but still came, and they decided to establish a new parish, and it was at the time Rokor was set up in 1920 as well in Serbia. It was a Russian church abroad, and therefore the parish, which was established in London, it was to be in jurisdiction of that Russian church abroad, which at the time it was called. Okay, I'll just go back. Sorry. Yeah. So at the time it was called the Supreme Ecclesiastical Administration of the Russian Orthodox Church. Later it became Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Rokor. In 1921, the rental of the previous embassy church came to an end, and therefore the parish moved St. Philip's Church in Victoria. This church was rented to Orthodox by Anglicans, because there was a good relationship at the time with the Anglican Church, and so they helped to provide this St. Philip's Church, which was basically redundant Anglican Church, which was not used. In 1923, sorry, earlier I said 28, in fact it was 1923, Father Eugene Smirnov died, and a new archpriest, John Leluhin, who was rector at the Archangelsk Cathedral in north of Russia, so he came over to the UK, and he was appointed as a rector. And in 1926, before basically going there, I just wanted quickly to okay. So in 1926, there was the first archbishop came to Russian Archbishop Seraphim Lukyanov, who was before Archbishop of Finland. But then when Finland Orthodox Church became independent, he was basically kicked out. So Metropolitan Vlogi sent him here to London, and where he served as vicar bishop for the British Isles. And his metropolitan was Metropolitan Vlogi Georgievsky, based in Paris at the time. And in 1925, before that, before Archbishop Seraphim came, there were celebrations, 1600 years of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in London. It was a massive celebration. It was attended by Anglican Church, by Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, lots of Anglican clergy, also patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem came, and Russian metropolitans, Antony Krapovitsky, who was the first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad, based in Serbia at the time, and also Metropolitan Vlogi Georgievsky came. He was basically part of the Metropolitan Antony's organization until 1926, and he was responsible for Western European churches. They all came to London. There was also quite a lot of Rococo clergy, massive celebration, and that's when a lot of Orthodox Church leaders and priests, they met with their counterparts of Anglican Church. Unfortunately, there were some disputes in 1926, which were fueled by Russian also Secret Service representatives, which were present in Paris and everywhere in Europe. And unfortunately, the Russian Church abroad was split into two jurisdictions. The actual Rococo remained managed by a synod, which was headed by the Metropolitan Antony Krapovitsky here. And what happened, that Metropolitan Vlogi Georgievsky, he created a so-called exarchate of the Russian Church. So effectively all the parishes split in Western Europe. So half of them stayed with Rococo, and half of them roughly went to Metropolitan Vlogi. So there was a schism, and they tried several times to reconcile, but they couldn't make it. Here you can see how the St. Philip's Church look inside. It was actually where currently Victoria bus station is. It was demolished in 1953, I think, and so that's basically to build the Victoria bus station, unfortunately. Right, so we move on to our next slide. So there were a few changes. Obviously, there was in charge of the Russian Rococo parish. The interesting thing happened because Russians didn't have any other churches. They only had one, St. Philip Church. What happened, they actually split, because the parish split into two. One, it was Rococo, another one, Exarchate, under Metropolitan Vlogi. So they served one Sunday, there will be a Rococo service. Next Sunday, there will be Exarchate service. Very, funny arrangement, but they carried like that for almost 30 years. and they were basically were the major like feasts like Pascha or Christmas or whatever. They basically did it in turns as well. It was a very weird arrangement, but that's how it worked, because they didn't have much money and they couldn't afford two churches. So but they lived quite amicably until 1943 when we discuss what happened then. So before that, the Bishop Nicholas Karpov in 1922 was appointed as the first Orthodox bishop with the title of Bishop of London since the time of St. Dunstan, 10th century. So you can see here. Unfortunately, he did not last long. He went to a synod meeting in Serbia, and he got appendicitis, and he died. A really ridiculous kind of event, but yeah, sometimes it happens. So since he died, this bishop vacancy remained, bishop cathedra remained vacant for quite some time. And there were a few changes, a few archpriests, Boris Molchanov, Michael Polsky. They were basically appointed as rector of the parish. Mikhail Polsky is very well known priest in Rokor. He actually experienced himself in Russia when he stayed after the revolution. He was imprisoned and he was in Gulag. He was in Solovki camps. And he managed to survive, to come through, and he managed to escape. And he, through I think the Iranian border, he went, and he arrived in I think in Palestine, and then he came here to London, and then he after he left London Parish in 1948, he went to Jordanville Monastery, I think, where he died. He wrote a book about the persecutions of Russian Church under the Bolsheviks, which then became, published, and actually it's exposed the torture and the hostilities, and how the Bolsheviks tried to basically to kill the Russian Church, to destroy it. Then also in 1941, there was a second parish established, Russian parish in Oxford, Archimandrite Nicholas Gibbs. Is he? No, I think he's on the next. There's no his picture here. Basically, he was an interesting biography. He was an Englishman. He went to Russia before the revolution, and he became eventually a teacher to the Tsar Nicholas II children. He taught them English language for quite a number of years. And when they were imprisoned and taken to Ekaterinburg and then basically executed, he was with the family until the very last moment. And then basically when the family was executed, he left Russia. Then he was based in China, and then moved here. He was quite unusual priest. He became basically a priest when he was in his 60s. He didn't have any theological education, and he was very independently minded, and he did not really want to listen to what Michael Polsky was telling him. So he wanted things to be done his own way. But he was very well known to Anglicans, and he actually got along with them. He also helped to establish the chapel in Wallasey. Sorry, not in Wallasey, in Norfolk. We talked about this. Sorry, just forgot the name, but it will come to me. And also in 1947 until 1941, Archimandrite Vitaly Ustinov, he became a rector of the parish. Later on, Archimandrite Vitaly became first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad. He moved to America, and he actually died there. He was the third hierarch, first hierarch of Rokor. So yeah, you can see him here. He was very strict, and he established monastic community in London as well. Right, move on. Carrying on. So in the cathedra, the bishop's cathedra in London, eventually was taken by Archbishop Nathaniel Wolff, who became a ruling bishop of the British Islands for Russian Orthodox Church abroad in 1950. Then there was a famous archpriest, Archpriest George Sheremetyev here. He also became archpriest when he was old, in his 60s. He comes from one of the richest Russian families, Sheremetyev family, and and after he retired from the church, he became the priest of the convent in London. He was very humble priest, and he was quite sickly in his late years. He also was, before he came to London, he was recruited as a translator, because after the Second World War there were lots of camps for displaced persons in Western Europe, mainly in Germany. So he was working there, and that's where he met Father Archimandrite Vitaly Ustinov, who was actually helping providing religious services to displaced persons in those camps. And he basically consecrated Father George to become a priest as well. Also in 1953, St. John Maximovich, he was appointed as the Archbishop of Brussels and Western Europe. So England was, so Archbishop Nathaniel and later Nikidim Nagaev, they reported sort of to him. They were vicar bishops of St. John. Also Archimandrite Nikodem here. He was a Russian general. Also comes from aristocratic Russian family, and he was in general in the First World War, and then he became a priest and an archimandrite, and later archbishop as well. So in 1956, the St. Philip's Church was closed, as I said, to make space for the bus station, and the divine services were. There was a small kind of church in Barons Court in London, which was originally bishop's residence, so they moved temporarily there. But in 1959, thank God, they managed to find new premises at St. Emperor's Gate, which is in West Kensington. You can see this church here, and that church was used for quite some time after that. This cathedral was consecrated by St. John of Shanghai Maximovich, who was the ruling bishop of the diocese. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, it's 45 minutes. Right. As I mentioned, there were lots of displaced persons in Europe after the Second World War. What happened when Germany Nazis occupied Soviet Union, which included countries of Ukraine, obviously Belarus, Baltic countries, then Russia itself. They actually took a lot of people and they sent them to Germany, because a lot of German men, they were conscripted as soldiers. So when they went to the front, to fight the war, and there were basically demand for people to go to the factories, to agriculture, basically to help the German economy. So what Nazis did, they took a lot of people from former Soviet countries, and they just basically transported them to Germany. And when Germany was defeated in the war and collapsed, there were the allies, Russia, Soviet Union, England, United Kingdom, and US and France. They set up camps for those people, because some of the people, most of these actually people, they didn't want to go back, obviously, to the communist Soviet Union. Some of them very unfortunate, because Churchill and Stalin agreed that they would be forced to go back, particularly the military people from the prisoners camps, and the people who lived in Russia after before they were taken to Germany. They were also forced to go back to Russia. It's only the people from West Ukraine, from Baltic republics, they were allowed to stay in Western Europe, and they were all resettled, and also Jewish people as well. They were all resettled in those camps. And when the future was discussed, one of the obviously solutions was just some of them stayed in Germany for good, but some of them were allowed to emigrate to other countries, to Australia, to United States, to South America, but also quite a few people actually came to United Kingdom. Not as many as, for example, to America or to Australia, but because English immigration law is very tough, was very tough, and is very tough as well, as you know, and it's not very easy to get here. It has never been. So, but some of the displaced persons managed to get here, particularly people who lived in Baltic countries, in Western Ukraine as well, and Belarus. So they actually, and because of that demand, they obviously didn't want to go to Russian churches. So they went to Rokor churches, because Rokor, Russian church abroad, was very anti-communist and very anti-Bolshevik. And because these people settled all over England, then several more churches were opened in Bradford, in Manchester, in Dublin, Nottingham, and there were also some temporary parishes opened in Leeds, Preston, Oldham, and Barton-on-Sea. Majority of these parishes don't exist any longer because there was no growth in community, and when the second generation of parishioners they didn't want to go. And for example, Father Paul, who is our priest in Liverpool, he told me that in the 70s he went, in the 80s he went and closed some of these parishes because they no longer could be supported by the parishioners, unfortunately. And you can see all these priests that were serving there. Archimandrite Ambrose Pagodian, yeah, he was then he went to after that he went to Jordanville Monastery, and he stayed there, and he wrote quite books. He was basically theologian. All right, move on. Yes, what happened in the second in the 70s, since the 1970s? Archimandrite Alex Popjoy, he was ministering the Diocese of Great Britain until Bishop Konstantin Isensky was consecrated in 1982. And then Archimandrite Alexis moved, and then he essentially was one of the persons who established the Brookwood Monastery in Surrey. Yeah, he is depicted here. In 1986, Archbishop Mark of Berlin, who is still alive, many of you have met him, I hope, or know of him. He was in charge because there was no bishop in UK after the Bishop Constantine died in 86. So then, almost for 30 years, Archbishop Mark was in charge of UK, of Russian diocese. He was ruling Bishop of London and Great Britain. Yes, someone wants to ask a question? Alexander? Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Father. Sorry, there was already a question in the chat about discussing in the split within Rokor. But I just wanted to add on to that around this time. Maybe it's in the text here somewhere, but could you explain the relationship at this time between Rokor and the Diocese of Sourozh, as it was, and I think is still known?
Yes. Let me just quickly check the next slide.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what happened? As I said, there was only really one Russian church after the Russian Revolution, 1917, and it was in 1926. It was split. It was the same church, but there were two parishes basically using the same church concurrently. So one was Rokor, the actual Rokor, and the other one was Exarchate. So what happened in 1946, in 1945, when the victory in the Second World War was celebrated, one Russian church in Russia, in Moscow, they decided that they needed to in 1943, there was a famous meeting between Stalin and the leaders of Russian church, because before that, Stalin was basically exterminating it. And there were literally, out of 300 bishops before the revolution, only 4 remaining. when Stalin decided to meet them. And the reason he met them, because there was a huge pressure on him. He wanted for the Allies to open a second front because he was really struggling. Soviet Union was really struggling in the war with Germany, with Nazis. And he was begging Churchill and Roosevelt to open a second front. But Roosevelt could not get approval in America because there was a pressure on him from the Episcopal Church. Because Stalin was persecuting church, they were demanding that Stalin stops persecution, and these demands were relayed to Stalin through different channels, and he decided basically to do just that. So he met with these four bishops. There was a secret meeting. He suddenly, instead of being their biggest enemy, he became one of their best friends, and he basically allowed them to. Basically, the persecutions, massive persecution, stopped at the time, and Russian Church basically was allowed to go internationally again, and basically establish or basically the existing communities abroad. They wanted to agree with them that they would join Russian Church again. So Metropolitan Nikolai, who was at the time one of the number 2 in Russian Church, he went to Paris. He came to London in 1945, and he was trying to convince the churches in Paris, the Exarchate, and also in London to join the Russian Church. He knew that Rokor would not do it because Rokor was totally anti-communist, and they said, until the communist regime exists in Russia, we have nothing to do with it. But he convinced the Metropolitan Evlogi, who was in charge of Exarchate, which had probably around 100 parishes around Europe, including the one in London. He actually agreed to join the Russian Church. So the parish in London became, from being Exarchate under the Constantinople Patriarchate, they basically became Russian. So the Russian Church then essentially started in London under the Moscow Patriarchate, started in 1945. And at the same time, the parish in Oxford, where the Archimandrite Nicholas Gibbs, I've told you about him, he also wanted to join the Russian Church, and they also took him in 1945. So that's when it started to grow. I will talk about obviously, the most important person in Russian Church in England was Metropolitan Anthony of Sourozh. He came to the UK in 1948 as a priest, and he then joined the Russian Church in 1948. And then he, I think, when the director of the Russian parish died, I think it was in 1950 or something like that, he then became a rector, and then essentially he became basically the head of the Russian Church, and then he was promoted Archimandrite, and then he became bishop and archbishop and metropolitan correspondingly. Yeah. So that basically that's the Russian Church. Okay, so the Rokor, just mindful of time, the Rokor. So Mark, we stopped at Archbishop Mark of Berlin. In 1990, Rokor purchased land in Chiswick, and the new church was started to be built. It was opened in 1999. You see it here. It's basically, I think, the only church in the UK which was built in a Russian kind of medieval sort of early Russian tradition. Yeah, many of you probably have seen it, have been there as well. If you haven't, you're welcome to come when you're visiting London. And that's my church. Right. So it was, and in 2007, Rokor, because obviously in 1990 Soviet Union collapsed, communists were no longer in power, and it took about 17 years, a lot of discussions between Rokor and Moscow Patriarchate, and eventually in 2007, Patriarch Alexis II, depicted here on this picture, and the Metropolitan Lover of Russian Church abroad, they signed a document basically uniting and be essentially joined. And at the moment, Rokor is an autonomous church within the Moscow Patriarchate. We operate quite independently. We have our own bishops and our own first hierarch, but but we in jurisdiction of Moscow Patriarchate. So there were a number of priests serving in London Church, Nikolai Savchenko, Vladimir Vingrets. And in 2018, the current bishop, Irenei, His Excellency, he was appointed as ruling bishop. And the new diocese of Great Britain, Western Europe, has been established. So we now basically ROCOR churches in outside of German-speaking countries in Europe. They basically managed from here. Okay. Yes, there were few monasteries established in the 19th century in England, Orthodox monasteries. One of them was St. John the Baptist Monastery in Essex. Many of you, I'm sure, familiar with it and have been there. It was established by the Archimandrite Sophrony, Sakharov, who was one of the most influential Orthodox spiritual writers of the 20th century. Before establishing monastery, Father Sophrony, he spent more than 20 years on Mount Athos, where he became a disciple of Saint Silouan, the Antonite. So this monastery is dedicated to St. John the Baptist, reflecting the monastic ideal of repentance and preparation for the kingdom of God. It is initially it was established under the Russian Moscow Patriarchate and Metropolitan Anthony of Sourozh. It was in his diocese. It was established in 1958, but later it was transferred in 1965. The monastery moved under direct jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and now it's I think it's Church of Cyprus in charge of it, and lots of Orthodox people. It has both convent and a monastery. There's a part where nuns live, and obviously part where monks live. And the relics of Archimandrite Sophrony are located there. He was canonized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 2019. And today, monastery is regarded as one of the most significant Orthodox spiritual centers in the United Kingdom. Also, there was a convent of Annunciation. You can see on this picture. This is the convent, which is in London, in Willesden. It was established in 1960 by the abbess Elizabeth Pennoff, who is on this picture here, and with the blessing of St. John of Shanghai, who came here to to establish the monastery. The convent. Abbess Elizabeth, she was one of the most important figures in the history of ROCOR monasticism. She lived in London. She was born, and her family lived in London between the two world wars, and then she moved to Palestine in 1940 to embrace the monastic life. And in 1945, she became abbess of the famous Gorny convent, Ein Karem convent in Jerusalem, which was located near the traditional birthplace of St. John the Baptist. And many of the nuns in those convents in Palestine, Holy Land, they were Palestinian Arabs. When there were some political upheavals surrounding the creation of the State of Israel, there were lots of wars there, probably, as you know. And then Mother Elizabeth and her several young nuns were forced to leave the country. And with the blessing of St. John of Shanghai, they came to England, to London, and they initially rented a space since 1954. And in 1959, in 1960, they moved to larger property. This convent was quite an important spiritual center. There were quite a few Russian Orthodox priests serving there. And when Abbess Elizabeth reposed in 1999, the monastery continued to exist. But unfortunately, after 2007, when ROCOR joined Moscow Patriarchate, some of the nuns who lived there, they did not agree with that decision, so they decided to instead to join the genuine Orthodox Church of Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece, which is a schismatic church of Greece, and they moved. The monastery moved to them, and when the last nun died, I think 2 or 3 years ago, it wasn't used for anything, and I think is now being sold for property development, unfortunately. There's also St. Edward Brotherhood Monastery in Brookwood in Surrey, which I already mentioned. You can see the picture here. It was established by a few monks, including Archimandrite Alexius Popjoy, and it was the church is dedicated to St. Edward's the Martyr, who was one of the later Anglo-Saxon kings of England, who was murdered in 1978 and later canonized. Originally, the building was Anglican chapel serving Brookwood Cemetery, but in the 80s, the chapel was acquired by a ROCOR and adapted for Orthodox worship. And in 1984, the relics of St. Edward the Martyr were transferred to the church. Yeah, so this parish currently also, unfortunately, in 2007, it moved under the jurisdiction of the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece, where I think it still exists under that, and it's still there. There's you can see there's cemetery, quite a few Orthodox graves there, so it's worth visiting. A really nice place. I've been there a few times. Okay, so we are now 1 hour. Okay, yeah, sorry, this is the Moscow Patriarchate. So I will move quickly now because we are already in time. So as discussed in 1926, when the parishes in London, when the church in London split into two, Archpriest Nikolai Baer and then Vladimir Teokritov took over running the Exarchate parish. And then that parish later came under the whole Exarchate in 1930, came under the umbrella of Ecumenical Patriarchate. And in 1945, I already explained you this parish, the Exarchate parish, it moved to Moscow Patriarchate. And in 1950, Antony Bloom, the Metropolitan Antony Bloom of Sourozh, he basically became director of the parish, and then and basically was in charge of the parish until 2003, when he was taken over. When the parish, oops, go back. Okay, so then it was taken over by bishops Anatoly Kuznetsov and Vicar. Then in 2002, there was Vicar Bishop Ilarion Alfeev, which is known, very well known church. In 1993, there was Vicar Bishop Basil Osborne consecrated, and he was in charge of diocese from 2003 to 2006. Then a few other bishops, Innocenti and Yelisei, ran the parish run the diocese, until 2017. And 2017, the current Bishop Matthew Andreev got in charge. The actual cathedral in Ennismore Gardens, many of you, I'm sure, have been there. It was basically given rented by Metropolitan Anthony in 1955, and then subsequently they purchased it, I think, in the 60s or in the 70s, and now it's owned by the Russian Church, Moscow Exarchate. Obviously, the church has grew substantially since then, and we will talk about it in more detail in our next webinar when we talk about the current situation. Right. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius Exarchate. This is quite interesting fellowship. It was established in 1928. There was a number of conferences between Russian Orthodox and Anglicans, where they in 1920s, when there were lots of immigrants living abroad, and they wanted to learn about the other religions. And Metropolitan Eulogy Georgievsky, whom we mentioned, who was in charge of the Exarchate, he had quite an ecumenical outlook. One of the reasons was that the famous Russian Ecumenical Council, not Ecumenical, Russian Council 1917, actually established a commission which said we need to study more the particularly Anglican Church and other churches to see whether we can establish intercommunion with them. Then obviously the Russian Church went into massive decline, was almost destroyed by Stalin and Bolsheviks. But Metropolitan Evlogi, because he emigrated, he continued that work, and he basically, his approach was to his diocese is that since we are now in Western countries, God must have sent us abroad to bring the Orthodoxy to the Western people. But before we can basically bring this Orthodoxy, we need to start dialogue. We need to start dialogue with the local churches. And in England, obviously, in the UK, it was Church of England. And Church of England also was quite ecumenical. It not quite ecumenical, it was probably the most ecumenical church. And a lot of clergymen and bishops of Church of England, they were the founders, and they were the main moving forces behind the ecumenical movement in 19th and 20th century. So they basically met with each other and they started discussions. They started conferences, and Nicholas Zernov was the gentleman who was at the time based in Paris, and then he moved to London. He started those conferences, which were mainly between young people initially. And the second Anglo-Russian conference, which was held at St. Albans in 1928, it was decided, it was, gosh, why is it doing that? So it was decided that a fellowship should be established where both parties, both churches can study each other, understand each other better, and its founders actually believed that closer relationship between the Anglican and Orthodox churches could contribute to Christian unity as well. So this second conference was a great success, and the Reverend William Tyndall, one of the, he was a Scottish actually Presbyterian, and he was the secretary, the main leader of the student Christian movement. He suggested that Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius should be formed. As you probably know, St. Alban is, well, we discussed him in our first webinar. He was the first British proto-martyr saint, and St. Sergius is a very famous Russian saint. So they decided to call it after their names, and then so the fellowship was established, and then two presidents were elected: Evlogi, the Russian Metropolitan of Western Europe, and also the old friend of the Russian Church, Bishop of Truro, Walter Freer. You can see him here, British English theologian, and also Father Sergei Bulgakov, who is very famous, one of the most famous Russian theologians. He became a vice president. Right, so Walter Freer, just a couple of words about him. He was the first actually monk to become a diocesan bishop since the Reformation in England, because as you know, the Reformation in England, they cancelled all the monasteries existing at the time, so there were almost no monasteries. So Walter Freer set up this monastic tradition again in the Church of England. He became the first monk, and then he became a diocesan bishop as well. He was, and he knew Russian Church, and generally he was really admirer of the Orthodox churches. He visited Russia in 1912, where he lectured in St. Petersburg and Moscow on the Anglican Church, and then he published quite a few books on the subject as well. So in terms of locations, the St. Basil House was purchased to host the fellowship, and traditionally the chairman and the presidents of the fellowship later became usually they were metropolitans of Russia, and also archbishops of Canterbury in Britain. So it was basically a fellowship on quite high level. So you can see the first building was located in London, in Ladbroke Grove. Then later they sold it, and okay, just a second, I'm just checking the dates. So this, and so in the 50s, this building was sold, and instead a building purchased in Oxford. They actually called it St. Gregory and St. Macrina. And this building still exists. It is still base of the fellowship. And also the Holy Trinity Annunciation Church was built in basically next to this building. And this church basically was originally planned to be for services between Anglicans and Orthodox. And the very famous Orthodox theologian Kallistos Ware, Metropolitan Kallistos, he was serving this church most of his life. So next slide shows the people who were involved into this fellowship. So when the fellowship started, the conferences which it held on annual basis were conducted on a quite high theological level, and most of the conferences were held in Hoddesdon, in Highley, and this center became closely associated with the fellowship history. And these summer gatherings, they came increasing number of leading theologians. At the time, there was a famous institute established in 1926 in Paris. It was the Institute of, sorry, if you just quickly go back, it's St. Sergius Orthodox Theological Institute was established in Paris by Russian Orthodox immigrants. And the institute became the principal center of the Orthodox theological education in Western Europe. And basically it actually, this main idea was to educate, prepare priests for services in churches, but also it actually developed theology, because church in Russia was persecuted. There was no theology developed at the time, obviously. The people just tried to survive, the clergymen and the archpastors. But in Paris, there were sort of, it developed into quite significant theologian center, and there were and the center attracted most influential Orthodox of the modern era, including Father Sergius Bulgakov, George Florovsky, Vladimir Losky, Nicholas Afanasiev, and Alexander Shmeman. And it became, as I said, it's center of the Orthodox theological revival. So yeah, you can see all these people here. Starting with Metropolitan Eulogy, who actually set up that Paris, and who was the first president of the fellowship. Then Father Sergei Bulgakov, Vasily Zinkovsky, Bishop Kassian, George Florovsky, they were, and then later Lev Giled, Vasily Krivoshein, and later Antony Blum was part of this fellowship. And there were also a number of the professors from the Paris Institute which participated in this fellowship. Nicholas Zernov, as I mentioned, he was the main sort of force behind setting up the fellowship and running it. Then famous Russian philosophers, religious philosophers such as Nicholas Berdyaev, George Fedotov, Losky, Karkashev, Lev Zander, Arseniev, and Shmeman, they were part of the institute. Then later, the fellowship was joined by a number of Greek Orthodox. Patriarch Athenagoras played a very important role. He basically was one of the chairman of the institute, and he supported. Sorry, not the institute. He supported the fellowship. Then Metropolitan Germanus, who was in charge of the Archdiocese of Thyatira, which included obviously UK and Europe. He was active participant in the fellowship, and later Metropolitan Kallistos Ware was also active participant. You can see lots of his lectures on YouTube. He was very important part of this. And now Archbishop Nikitas, Archbishop of Thyatira, Nikitas, he plays a role in as well. From the Russian side, Father Andrew Laus, who's still alive, who is one of the most famous currently living theologians, and the gentleman, the priest in charge of the fellowship is Father Stephen Platt. Many of you probably know him. He's a rector of our Oxford parish, but he also in charge of fellowship. And Bishop Matthew of Sourozh is also one of the patrons of fellowship. From the Church of England side, I already mentioned Walter Frere, who played an important role. Also, Bishop Charles Gore, who was a very active ecumenical leader. He was and Orthodox supporter. He was played an important part in setting up the fellowship and running it. Then a number of bishops and clergy: John Douglas, Canon John Douglas, Bishop Headlam, Bishop Rawlinson, Geoffrey Fisher. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1944, and then he was succeeded by Michael Ramsey, famous British theologian. He was Archbishop of Canterbury as well after Bishop Fisher stepped down. I think it was 1964. Then a number of other important Anglican figures. And Archbishop Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, he is no longer Archbishop, but he was. Many of you know him and probably have heard his lectures. He's one of the most famous British theologians at the moment. So the fellowship helped to introduce Orthodox theology and spirituality to an English-speaking audience. It basically helped to familiarize Anglicans with the writings of the Eastern Church Fathers, and also introduced Orthodox liturgical traditions. It also served as a meeting point for Russian refugees and British Christians interested in Orthodoxy. And even after the Second World War, the fellowship continued to exist and foster dialogue despite the political tensions that were existing between Soviet Union and Britain, United Kingdom. A lot of Orthodox theological works were translated due to the fellowship, and many of future Orthodox clergy in Britain and converts were first encountered Orthodoxy through fellowship events and publications. Its annual conferences became renowned for bringing together leading Orthodox and Anglican thinkers. These conferences still happened. I attended the last one, which was last year, in a place near Oxford. It's not huge in numbers. There are probably about 40 people, but it was quite interesting. Father Andrew Laus was there, and obviously Father Stephen was in charge. So the fellowship, just to clarify, it never saw that institutional merger between the two churches, between Anglican Church and Church of England and Orthodox churches, but it aimed to deepen mutual understanding, friendship, and theological dialogue. Again, it remains active still and widely regarded as one of the most significant organizations in the history of the Anglican-Church relations and the growth of Orthodoxy in the United Kingdom. It actually helped us to understand each other better, and basically the Anglicans, they always supported Orthodox churches developing this country. They don't like proselytism, as none of us does, when we try actively to, and nobody does it, try to actively poach members of one church to another. But the peaceful, as they say, coexistence and supporting each other has been the result of this fellowship. Right. So to summarize all these slides, so the Orthodoxy in Britain re-emerged during 18th, 19th centuries through Greek and Russian communities, leading to the establishment of churches, chapels, and educational initiatives. The Russian Orthodox Church in London became an important center of Orthodox life, and also Greek churches were established, quite a few of them in the 19th century, continued to grow in the 20th centuries. Then the efforts to improve relations between Anglicans and Orthodox Christians led to theological dialogue, including early reunion discussions, which resulted in the fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius Foundation in the 1920s. And also the 20th century witnessed a remarkable Orthodox theological revival influenced by Russian immigrant theologians associated with institutions such as Sergius Institute in Paris and a number of establishments set up by the Greek Orthodox communities. Three monasteries were established in UK during that time. Unfortunately, two of them exist, but still good. By the end of 20th century, Orthodoxy developed from a small immigrant presence into a vibrant and growing part of the Britain's Christian landscape with churches, monasteries, theological institutions, and pilgrimage centers across the country, and it's still growing. There's obviously massive other communities such as Romanian and Antiochian, which we're going to talk about next lecture. So talking about next webinar, it's not going to be next week, it's going to be a week after. I will send you email and reminder on Telegram. So what we're going to talk about is where is the Orthodoxy in Britain today. We will discover the remarkable growth of the Orthodox Christianity across England, Scotland and Wales, Northern England, with hundreds of parishes, monasteries and missions serving diverse communities. We also look at who are the Orthodox Christians of modern Britain. We will explore different Orthodox jurisdictions, their histories, traditions, and contributions to the British religious and cultural life. And lastly, we could also start discussion about what does the future hold. We will examine the opportunities, challenges, and the mission of the Orthodoxy in 21st century Britain, as we seek to preserve our heritage and reaching a new generation of believers. Okay, so now we will finish with a short quiz. After we have the Q&A session, we will finish with a short quiz to test your knowledge, and then and a short final feedback. So it's now Q&A time, and you are welcome to ask any questions. I hope it was interesting and you learned a bit.
Well, I'll jump in. I was actually kind of taken back by what you said earlier, where Tsar Nicholas visited the one church and he just didn't like the choir, so he's like, "Hey, we need to send some people there," because I knew he was well explored. Here in the U.S., at least where I'm at in Ohio, we have a little church along one of the lakes, and he actually paid for the iconostasis and like the some of the stuff used during the liturgy was all donated by Tsar Nicholas. It's
All
like
right.
yeah, really interesting to, hear the efforts that he kind of like put forth for Orthodoxy even across the pond, I guess.
But my understanding that he didn't visit US, he only came to England, I think, and some
Nope.
other European countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess he never made it across, but yeah, he did send a lot of stuff over here to kind of help out with the missions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. He basically came here. He was really angry. He didn't like the choir at all. Yeah, but actually that worked well for because they had a good choir after that.
Yeah. Well,
All right. Any more questions, clarifications, any sort of comments? Maybe some additional information you might know. Okay, so in this case, if no more questions, what I suggest, let's do the quiz. Hopefully you will be able to answer the questions. I'll say it will be 5 questions. They are actually multiple choice. Only one answer is correct for each question. So, okay, just double checking. This is okay. So you have let's say 5 minutes. It's relatively straightforward. Okay, I'm launching it. Yeah, I also apologize that I haven't covered much the Greek Church. But we're going to talk about it next week as well, because there's so much obviously information. I just focused on the Russian Church because there was lots of stuff happening there as well. But next webinar we will have a more detailed discussion about other churches as well.
Mine has disappeared. Can you pop that back up again, please?
Yeah,
Has it disappeared?
yeah, mine's disappeared as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mine as
that's
well.
strange. Okay, let me. This is really strange. Okay, it tells me if I relaunch, then it will clear all the existing poll results. Okay, just a second. I'll see what else I can do. That's really strange. Yeah, something happened. It also clicked on my sort of blinked on my computer as well. All right. Okay, basically, if I relaunch it, can you please answer it again then? Yeah, because it's asking me to, if you could, yeah, because it actually erased all the previous information. I don't know why. But hopefully it will be quick for you, just because you already answered it. Yeah. My apologies for that. Okay, 10 more seconds. All right, I'm closing it now, and I'll share the results as well. Okay, you can see now the correct results. Do you see it? The screen?
Yes, it's fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much. Most of you, answered correctly. Yeah, the first question was, only one person did not answer it correctly. Second question, everyone answered it. Third one, 4 people did not answer it correctly, and Fourth one more difficult. The correct answer is Antikhon Belavin, future Patriarch of Russia. And the fifth, yeah. Okay, great. So now, if I share the poll, where I would really appreciate if you basically provide your feedback, and also if you could leave at the end your email, so that if basically there will be any changes in regards to the final webinar, I can reach you there. Okay, so let me launch that. It's only 3 quick questions. Okay. Provide your ratings. That would be really helpful. Sorry. Yeah, also, there was a question in the chat box about the sharing the results. Yeah, it will be shared, as I said, initially after the final webinar. We'll put all 5 of them on YouTube, and we will send you by email all the links, a link to that YouTube channel. Okay, 10 more seconds, and I finished. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, everyone, for ending the poll now. Okay. Thank you very much for your participation. So I hope it was interesting. So I will see you in not next week, but week after on Wednesday. But I will send you emails as well to confirm that if there are any changes as well. Yeah, the reason I'm not having it next week, because I'm going to pilgrimage to Georgia with a group of 30 people. I've never been there before, so hopefully, well, people say it would be very interesting.
Cool. Have a great time.
Yep, thank you very much, and you too.
Unfortunately, I had to miss last week's lecture, so I'm asking: is there any way that I can catch up on that?
Yeah. As I said, we will put everything on YouTube channel after the final lecture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you soon.
Cheers.
Have a great evening.
Yes, you too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Come noche.